The journey has been long and the path difficult, but the final resolution is finally within your reach at the end. Stay with us as we piece together the last bit of the puzzle to reveal the truth. Hit subscribe now and witness the most important ending today. I survived 3 tours in Vietnam, 2 helicopter crashes, and a decade-running covert logistics operations in places that don't appear on any government map. I buried friends in jungles whose names I still can't say out loud. I watched empires of corruption collapse under the weight of their own greed, and I walked away from all of it with nothing but a duffel bag, a limp in my left knee, and the knowledge that I had kept my country safe in ways it would never acknowledge. None of that prepared me for what I found when I came home. My name is Robert Callahan. I am 63 years old. And 8 years ago, I made the worst decision of my life, not in a war zone, not in some smoke-filled room with generals and intelligence officers, but in my own kitchen in Portland, Oregon, standing across from my younger sister, while our mother sat between us at the table she had owned for 40 years. I need to go back. That is the only way this makes sense. Our mother, Eleanor Callahan, built everything we had from nothing. Our father left when I was 9, and my sister Diane was 6. No note, no forwarding address, no child support, just gone. My mother worked double shifts at the textile mill during the week and cleaned office buildings on weekends. She never complained. Not once. She made sure Diane and I had school clothes, Christmas presents, and enough food that we never went to bed hungry. She was the strongest person I have ever known, and I have known some extraordinary people. When I was 18, I enlisted. My mother drove me to the recruitment office herself, squeezed my hand in the parking lot, and told me to come back in one piece. I did, eventually, though it took longer than either of us expected. The military became my life not because I loved war, but because I was good at the work and because staying useful felt like the least I could do for the country that had given my mother a place to raise 2 kids alone. Diane took a different path. She married young, a man named Gerald Hutchins, who sold commercial real estate and had the handshake of a politician and the eyes of something colder. I never liked him. Gerald was the kind of man who calculated every kindness in advance, who smiled with his mouth but never with anything deeper. But Diane loved him, and my mother loved Diane, so I kept my opinions to myself through 20 years of holidays and phone calls and the occasional strained visit. Our mother retired at 68. By then, I had mustered out of active service and transitioned into private sector work, security consulting, logistics coordination for international firms, the kind of employment that pays well and asks few questions about your past. I spent most of my time overseas: Bangkok, Lagos, Bogota, Doha. The work was demanding and the contracts were long, but I sent money home every month without exception. Not a small amount. My mother had given me everything she had. The least I could do was make sure her retirement was comfortable. 8 years ago, I came home for what I thought was a routine visit between contracts. My mother had just turned 74. She seemed healthy, sharp, happy in her small house in the Willamette Valley that I had helped her buy a decade earlier. She had her garden, her church friends, her Thursday book club. She was fine. That visit was also when Gerald made his proposal. He sat down across from me at that kitchen table with a folder of documents and a very smooth presentation. The property market in the Columbia River Gorge was, he said, experiencing a once-in-a-generation opportunity. There was a property, 4 acres, a renovated farmhouse, a guest cottage, river views that could be acquired for $1.2 million. Gerald had identified it for investment purposes. He wanted my mother to put her house up as partial collateral and contribute her savings as a down payment. The property would be held jointly between my mother, Gerald, and Diane. Rental income would cover the mortgage. In 5 years, Gerald projected, the property would be worth 3 times the purchase price. My mother looked at me across the table with the expression she had always used when she wanted my opinion but didn't want to ask for it directly. I looked at Gerald and I said, I need to see the title history, the rental projections, and the comps from the past 3 years before I can have an opinion. Gerald said he would have everything ready by the end of the week. He did not have everything ready by the end of the week. He had partial documents, vague projections, and an explanation for every gap that somehow created two more questions for everyone it answered. I told my mother I was not comfortable with the arrangement. I told her the property would be in Gerald's name in all practical terms, regardless of what the paperwork said. I told her Gerald had the kind of financial confidence that men develop when they are spending other people's money. My mother listened carefully. Then she told me that Diane had been struggling, that Gerald's business had hit a difficult period, that she wanted to help her daughter the way she had always helped her children, and that this was her money and her decision to make. I had a flight out of Portland in 4 days. I was under contract. I had obligations I could not break. I should have broken them. I left. I told myself my mother was a competent adult who had the right to make her own choices. I told myself I would stay in close contact, would monitor the situation from a distance, would come back the moment anything looked wrong. I called every 2 weeks for the first year. Then the calls started going differently. My mother seemed distracted, tired, sometimes confused in ways that I attributed to age. When I asked about the property, she said everything was fine. When I asked about Diane, she said Diane was busy. When I asked if she needed anything, she said no. In the second year, the calls became shorter. In the third year, my mother stopped answering sometimes. When I reached Diane to ask if everything was all right, she told me our mother was doing well, but that the time difference made regular calls difficult, and that too much outside contact was actually causing our mother anxiety. That was the sentence that I should have acted on immediately. I have replayed it thousands of times since. Instead, I accepted it, because I wanted to believe my sister, and because I was in the middle of a situation in Doha that demanded my complete attention, and because I told myself I would be home in 8 months, and I would assess everything in person. 8 months became 14. The contract extended. Then there was a transition period. Then another contract. 8 years passed. The calls had dwindled to once a month by the 5th year, and in the 6th year they stopped entirely. Diane told me our mother had developed a form of mild cognitive decline, and that phone calls sometimes agitated her. She told me the doctors recommended limiting stimulation. She sent me photographs occasionally, my mother in the garden, my mother at the kitchen table, my mother in what appeared to be a comfortable chair on a nice porch. The photographs looked fine. My mother looked fine in them, if older, if quieter. I sent money every month. I had been sending it to a joint account that Gerald had set up years earlier for household management. The withdrawals from that account, I would later learn, told a very different story than the photographs. I came home in October, 2 years ago, unannounced. I had not told Diane I was returning. I had not mentioned it to Gerald. My last contract had ended. I was considering retirement, and I had decided that I needed to see my mother with my own eyes before I made any decisions about what came next. I flew into Portland, rented a car, and drove south toward the valley. The farmhouse in the gorge was the address I had on file. The small house in the valley, where my mother had lived for 20 years, had been sold. I had been told, because the property investment had necessitated consolidating assets. My mother lived at the farmhouse now. Diane had explained years ago in one of her careful, pleasant, information-light emails. I pulled up to the property on a Tuesday afternoon in a light rain. The farmhouse was large and well-maintained, set back from a gravel drive behind an iron gate. The grounds were immaculate. There was a new truck in the driveway and a late-model sedan beside it. The guest cottage at the edge of the property had curtains in the windows and potted plants on the porch. I sat in my rental car at the edge of the road for a long time. Something was wrong. I could not have explained it scientifically. It was the same instinct that had kept me alive in a dozen situations where the data said I was safe, but something deeper said otherwise. The property looked prosperous. My mother was supposed to be here, comfortable and cared for. Everything looked correct. It felt completely wrong. I had a contact in Portland, a woman named Sandra Okafor, who had spent 12 years with the Oregon Department of Justice before going private. We had worked together on an asset recovery case 5 years earlier. I called her from the car and asked her to run a search on the property title and on Gerald and Diane Hutchins. While I waited, I drove to a motel in Hood River and checked in under a name that had served me in other circumstances. I ate a sandwich from a gas station and spread out what I had on the small table by the window. Property records I had been able to access myself. The joint account statements I had kept copies of. The photographs Diane had sent. Sandra called me back at 11 that night. The farmhouse property, she told me, had been refinanced twice since purchase. The original mortgage had been paid off using a combination of my mother's savings, the sale proceeds from my mother's valley house, and a significant portion of the monthly transfers I had been sending for years. The property was held in a trust in which Gerald was the sole trustee and my mother was listed as a dependent beneficiary with no independent withdrawal rights. Diane held a secondary interest. My mother's personal bank accounts, the ones she had held independently for 40 years, had been consolidated into the household management account and then closed. There were no accounts in my mother's name alone. Sandra had also pulled the property's utility accounts, which are public record in Oregon. The primary residence, the farmhouse, was listed under Gerald and Diane Hutchins. The guest cottage had a separate utility account. That account was listed under Eleanor Callahan. My mother was living in the guest cottage. I sat with that for a very long time. I called Sandra back and asked her to find out everything she could about the trust documents. Then I drove back to the farmhouse the next morning, parked down the road, and waited. At 7:45, I watched my mother come out of the guest cottage carrying a laundry basket. She walked across the wet grass to the main house, let herself in through the side door, and did not come out for 2 hours. When she did, she was carrying a different basket, full of folded clothes. She walked back to the guest cottage, went inside, and did not come out again. She was doing their laundry. My mother, 79 years old, was walking across a wet lawn in the October cold to do laundry for the people living in the house that had been purchased with her money and her home. I made myself stay in the car. Every operational instinct I had ever developed told me that acting on emotion before I had the full picture was how operations failed. I made myself breathe. I made myself think. I called Sandra again and asked her to find me a lawyer who specialized in elder financial abuse and trust litigation. I also asked her to find out whether my mother had any independent legal representation, whether anyone had ever been appointed to act in her interest alone. The answer, of course, was no. Over the next 3 weeks, I worked. I had rented a small house in Hood River under a name I trusted. I kept a low profile. I drove past the farmhouse at different hours, at different intervals, building a picture of the daily patterns. My mother came out of the guest cottage every morning between 7 and 8. She went to the main house. She came back in the late afternoon. On Saturdays, a car I eventually identified as belonging to a grocery delivery service arrived. My mother signed for the delivery and carried the bags inside the main house herself. I watched Gerald leave for what appeared to be golf 3 mornings a week. I watched Diane take the sedan on errands, always returning with shopping bags. I watched my mother hang laundry on a line behind the guest cottage in weather that had dropped below 40 degrees. On the 14th day, I walked up to the guest cottage while Gerald and Diane were both out. My mother answered the door. She looked at me the way you look at a stranger. Her eyes moved over my face and found nothing familiar. I am older than she last saw me. I have gray in my beard now. I was wearing a cap and a jacket I had not owned on my last visit 8 years ago. She said, "Can I help you?" I said, "Mom, it's Robert." She stared at me for a long time. Then something moved across her face, not recognition exactly, but the effort toward it. She stepped back from the door and pressed her hand against the wall like she needed the support. I stepped inside. The cottage was small. 1 bedroom, a sitting room, a bathroom, a narrow kitchen. The furniture was spare but clean. There was a television and a shelf of books. There was a framed photograph of me and Diane as children, sitting on top of the bookshelf. And then I saw it, on the small kitchen table, a legal document, folded open to a page she had apparently been reading, a power of attorney agreement, giving Gerald sole authority to manage her financial and medical affairs. The signature line had not been filled in yet. There was a pen beside it. I took the document off the table. I read it carefully. I photographed every page. Then I sat down across from my mother, and I asked her, as gently as I could, how long she had been living in the cottage. She told me 3 years. I asked her how she was spending her days. She told me she helped with the house. Laundry, some cleaning, preparing meals on evenings when Diane asked her to. She said it with the matter-of-factness of someone who has been told often enough that this is normal, that they have stopped questioning it. I asked her if she was happy. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I get cold." I kept my voice very steady. I told her I was going to fix things. I told her not to sign anything until she had spoken with a lawyer of her own, someone I would bring to see her. I told her not to tell Diane or Gerald that I had been there. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "You came back." I said, "I should have come back years ago." She nodded like she already knew that. She didn't say anything else about it. I left the cottage and sat in my rental car for a long time, doing nothing. There is a version of me that existed before certain experiences that might have driven back to that house, knocked on the front door, and done something I would have regretted enormously. That version of me was a younger man. The version of me that exists now understood that what Diane and Gerald had done was a crime, that crimes leave evidence, and that evidence properly assembled is more effective and more permanent than any confrontation in a driveway. I called Sandra and told her I needed the elder abuse attorney within 48 hours. Her name was Patricia Vance. She had 20 years of experience in Oregon, trust litigation, and financial elder abuse cases. She was 61, direct, and appeared to be allergic to any sentence that wasn't immediately useful. I respected her within the first 5 minutes of our meeting. I laid out everything I had: the trust documents, the account consolidation history, the sale of my mother's house, the power of attorney document that was currently sitting on my mother's kitchen table with a pen beside it, the 8 years of monthly transfers to the household management account, the photographs, my own documented observations over the past 2 weeks. Patricia was quiet through all of it. She made notes without looking up. When I finished, she set down her pen and said, "How quickly can you get me access to your mother for an independent interview?" I said, "Thursday." Patricia came to the cottage on Thursday morning while Gerald was at golf and Diane was at what appeared to be a standing hair appointment. She spent 2 hours with my mother. I waited in my car down the road. Patricia came out with a legal pad full of notes and the expression of someone who had just confirmed exactly what she expected. She told me my mother was cognitively intact. The mild cognitive decline that Diane had been describing to me for years was, in Patricia's assessment and that of the independent neurologist she was going to bring in, not supported by any legitimate medical documentation. There was a single note in my mother's file from a physician who had since left the practice, describing mild age-related memory concerns in appropriately cautious medical language. That note had been characterized to me, over years of careful emails, as a progressive condition requiring isolation and reduced outside contact. It was not that. My mother was a 79-year-old woman with entirely normal cognition for her age, who had been gradually, systematically separated from her independence, her assets, and her family. Patricia filed for an emergency protective order on the following Monday. The filing cited financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, fraudulent transfer of assets, and undue influence in the creation of the trust. As part of the filing, Patricia requested that the unsigned power of attorney be declared void and that an independent court-appointed guardian review all existing estate documents. I was in Hood River when Gerald called me. I had given my personal number to Diane years ago, and Gerald had apparently found it. He called me on a Wednesday afternoon, and he was not using his real estate voice. He wanted to know what I thought I was doing. He said my mother had willingly entered into every agreement. He said I had been absent for 8 years and had no standing to walk in and disrupt arrangements that had been working well for everyone. He said if I was trying to cause legal problems, I should understand that he had documentation for every decision that had been made. I let him talk. When he was finished, I said, "I'll see you in court, Gerald." Then I called Sandra and asked her to document the call. What followed over the next 4 months was neither fast nor simple. Patricia had warned me it would not be. Elder financial abuse cases rarely are, because the exploitation is often structured to appear voluntary because the victims are frequently unable to advocate clearly for themselves, and because the perpetrators are usually family members who can claim they were helping. But my mother was cognitively intact. That was the fact Gerald had not accounted for. He had built his entire defense around the premise that my mother had made these decisions freely, that she understood what she was signing, that the trust arrangement was designed to protect her. When my mother sat across from a court-appointed examiner and described, in precise and specific detail, how she had been told that putting everything in Gerald's name was the only way to protect it from taxes, how she had been discouraged from calling her son because it upset her, how she had been moved into the cottage because the main house was too much space for one person, and how she had been asked repeatedly to sign documents that Gerald told her were routine, the defense of voluntary consent began to collapse. It collapsed completely when Patricia's forensic accountant traced the household management account disbursements and found that over 8 years, $340,000 had been transferred to accounts held in Gerald's name alone. $95,000 had been used for personal expenses, vacations, furniture, 2 cars that had no connection to my mother's care or living situation, and the rental income that Gerald had projected in his original presentation had never materialized because the property had never been rented. My mother had funded their life for 8 years, not as a beneficiary of a family investment, as a source. In February, Gerald and Diane were charged with financial elder abuse, fraudulent transfer of assets, and undue influence. Gerald's real estate license was suspended pending the criminal investigation. The trust was dissolved by court order. The property, which had been purchased substantially with my mother's assets, was ordered sold, with the proceeds after legitimate mortgage costs returned to my mother. Diane called me twice during this period. The first call, she cried, and told me I was destroying the family. The second call, she told me that our mother had wanted this, that I had never been there, that I didn't understand the sacrifices she had made. I didn't respond to either call. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said more precisely in a court filing. My mother moved out of the cottage in March. I had found a house for her, a single-story craftsman in a neighborhood in Portland with a garden space, a community nearby, and a guest room. I hired a care coordinator who visited twice a week, not because my mother needed intensive care, but because she had spent years with no one looking after her interests, and I intended to change that. The first morning in the new house, my mother made coffee in her own kitchen. She stood at the window looking out at the backyard, a modest square of lawn, bare in the early spring, but hers, and she didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "I think I'll put tomatoes back there in the summer." I said, "That sounded like an excellent plan." She turned and looked at me with the expression I remembered from when I was a child, the one she used when she wanted me to understand something she wasn't going to state directly. She said, "I knew you'd come back. I just didn't know it would take this long." I said, "I know. I'm sorry." She nodded once, the way she always had when she considered a matter addressed, and then she went to find where she had packed the cups. The trial concluded in the fall. Gerald received 32 months and 3 years of supervised probation. Diane received 18 months with the possibility of early release. The judge's comments at sentencing were not gentle. She described what Gerald and Diane had done as a systematic and calculated exploitation of an elderly woman's trust in her own family, and she said the fact that the victim was the perpetrator's own mother and sister made it not a mitigating factor, but an aggravating one. I sat in the back of the courtroom for the sentencing. My mother sat beside me. She wore the blue cardigan she had owned since I could remember, and she sat very straight, the way she had always sat, and she watched the proceedings with the same quiet attention she had brought to everything her entire life. When it was over, we walked out into a gray November afternoon and stood on the courthouse steps. I asked her how she was feeling. She considered the question seriously, the way she always had. She said, "I feel like going home and having a cup of tea." We drove back to Portland. She made tea. We sat in her kitchen, at a table that was hers and only hers, in a house where no one would ask her to do the laundry or sign documents she didn't understand or stay in a cottage because the main house was too much space for one person. The light through the window was the particular gray gold of a Pacific Northwest autumn afternoon, And my mother wrapped both hands around her cup the way she had when I was 8 years old, and she was working double shifts, and the world was very hard, but she was still here, still warm, still exactly herself. I thought about all the years I had been away, all the places I had been that I told myself mattered more urgently than a phone call, a visit, a plane ticket home. I had spent decades keeping strangers safe while my mother was left unguarded by the one person in the world who should have known better. There is no version of that accounting that comes out clean, I know that. What I know also is this: I am here now. The chair across from her is mine. The drive to Portland on Sunday afternoons is mine. The phone calls every single day, never skipped, never shortened, are mine. She is 81 years old, and she is well, and she is home. That is what I came back for. That is what I should have come back for years earlier. And if you are somewhere far away right now, telling yourself that distance is manageable, that things are probably fine, that you will get home when the contract ends, or the situation stabilizes, or the timing is better, I am asking you to hear me when I say this. There is no timing better than now. There is no distance worth the cost of arriving late. Go home.